Okay, so in our last episode, we discovered that, okay, so both Euthyphro and Socrates are there for legal issues. Euthyphro is suing his father. Socrates is being sued for corrupting the youth. So Euthyphro's charge against his father, if you recall, Socrates was surprised and said, wow, only somebody, well advanced in wisdom would be able to pull something like this off. And Euthyphro said, yeah, of course. In other words, there's a little vanity there in that he's agreeing with Socrates that he's very wise. Now, around 4b, we begin talking about the actual charge. And here's where the charge actually begins at around 4c. I've cut the paragraph in half. He says, for the pollution is the same if you associate knowingly with such a man who did not purify yourself and him by proceeding against him. In this case, the man who was killed was a hired workman of mine, and when we were farming in Naxos, he was working there on our land. Now he got drunk, got angry with one of our house slaves, and butchered him. So my father bound him hand and foot, threw him in the ditch, and sent a man here to Athens to ask the religious advisor what he ought to do, presumably, to do. In the meantime, he paid no attention to the man as he lay there bound and neglected him, thinking that he was a murderer and did not matter if he were to die. And that is exactly what happened to him, for he died of hunger and cold in his bonds before the messenger came back from the advisor. Now my father and the rest of my relatives are angry with me because for the sake of this murderer, I am prosecuting my father for murder. For they say he did not kill him, and even if he had killed him, never so much. Yet since the dead man was a murderer, I ought not to trouble myself about such a fellow. Okay, so let's look at the charge. So the dead guy is, well, there's actually two dead guys. One is the servant, right? Because the servant killed a slave. Okay, so first of all, to make sense of this, so most, somewhat affluent people in Athens who are wealthy enough to own slaves, it sort of went like this. You'd have, a farm, a family farm, which was called an oikos. And this was like, oikos is a word that means like household, estate, farm. It's all of those things. Think of like maybe, any farm, a family farm. And the father was the guy in charge, obviously. And the deal is, underneath the father would be the rest of the family, and then you would have servants, and then under servants you could have slaves, if you were wealthy enough. But the father is in charge. And there was no justice per se, like we would understand today. There were no police in Athens. The courts, like we were saying, there weren't like lawyers and judges and stuff. And so how it worked is that the father was the guy who was in charge of dispensing justice on the oikos. Okay, so keep that in mind. So there's two dead guys. One, the servant who killed the slave. Now, we're taking it as given that the guy murdered the slave. Okay? And then number two, what happens? Well, the servant, or the father, right, detains the murderer, the servant, right? And while the servant is bound up, then the father sends to the priests in Athens, right? So he sends a messenger to the priests, and then this guy, not servant, dies, right? While, the messenger's coming and going. So the question is this murder? Now, let's not, don't put this in terms of, we don't want to spend too much time, law and ordering this. This servant was a murderer. By all accounts, the father could have simply put this guy to death, and that would have been the end of it, and nobody would bat an eye, because it's the father's prerogative on the oikos to dispense justice. But instead, what does the father do? instead of out and out killing the guy, he gives him a chance. He detains him and sends to the priests to dispense justice, therefore ensuring that the most just thing will be done. So in other words, what the father actually did was to cut the servant more slack than he would have deserved under Athenian law. Let's not, be America 2018 here. Under Athenian law. Okay, so the question is this murder? And to the average Athenian, it's like, absolutely not. There's no way you could get murder out of this. In American court system, maybe you could have got negligent homicide, right? I mean, think about it. Even in, I'm talking here in Texas. In Texas, under the castle law, you can shoot somebody who, comes onto your property without permission, right? And you're not going to jail. So rather than shoot somebody, what if you detain them? And in the struggle, you fight them and they get a cut and they bleed. So is that murder, or is shooting the guy outright murder? You see? But anyways, to the Athenians, there's no way this was murder at all. So the next question becomes, why is Euthyphro going against his father? Because you would owe your father the utmost respect. The only time you would even be, vaguely justified in bringing your father to trial is if a whole bunch of people saw him murder somebody, or a bunch of people like mercilessly or something. But this, like, super gray area where there's not really a murder, and you're using this to justify suing your father, then something's really up. And that's why he says that, everyone's angry at him, and rightly so. Wait, this is important. He says, going back to 4D, for they say he did not kill him, and even if he had killed him, never so much. Yet since the dead man was a murderer, I ought not to trouble myself about such a fellow, because it is unholy for a son to prosecute his father for murder, which shows how little they know about the divine law in regard to holiness and unholiness. So, in other words, it's like, and I'm going to use this word, pious. So to justify himself, Euthyphro is using the concept of piety or holiness, right? So what he's saying is, well, you're going to, criticize me because, I'm suing my father on some ridiculous thing. But what he's saying is, no, but I'm being pious and I'm being holy. I bring up pious because most translations bring up pious. And if you read the Euthyphro in another translation, they may likely have used this word pious or piety. So what he's saying is, no, I'm going to justify myself because, in fact, I am being holy and I am being pious. Okay, and so obviously then here's the deal. As we'll see, Socrates is going to pick up on this. And Socrates says, but in the name of Zeus, Euthyphro, do you think your knowledge about divine laws and holiness and unholiness is so exact that when the facts are as you say, you're not afraid of doing something unholy yourself and prosecuting your father for murder? I should be of no use, Socrates. And Euthyphro would be in no way different from other men if I did not have exact knowledge about such things. So notice, what's going on here with Euthyphro is vanity. Right? So we've seen a couple instances now where he says, oh, yeah, I can do it because I really know a lot, right? I'm very far advanced in wisdom. And here, yeah, most people can't do it, but, I'm better than most, so I'm going to be able to pull this off. So what do we got so far? We've got, Euthyphro's case here is, negligible at best. He's after his father for something, that's for sure, but it's not, for murder. It wouldn't be a just charge. But he's saying that he's being holy and pious because he's bringing his father to court. The next little bit is sort of we can kind of skip over. Socrates is making a joke to Euthyphro. He says basically, wow, you are so young and yet so wise. I should make you my student, or I should become your student, so that when my charges are brought against me, I can say, hey, Euthyphro is my teacher, so don't, get mad at me, get mad at Euthyphro. And that's what he's saying here, but we can kind of skip it over. But here's where this is kind of where the dialogue really begins, here at 5D, when Socrates asks this question. He says, tell me, then, what do you say holiness is, and what is unholiness? So it's very simple. What Socrates is asking Euthyphro is to define holy or pious, okay? Again, I'm going to use the pious because most translations use pious. Okay. Because obviously, why do we want to understand what holiness is? Because holiness is being used to justify. Okay, I'm going to go out and I'm going to say this, an unjust act. Okay? So what he's saying, why is it an unjust act? Because there was no murder. The father did not commit murder. And so why is Euthyphro after him? Well, who knows, for something else. Maybe he's got daddy issues. Maybe he wants his dad's farm. If they have slaves, they've got a lot of money. So maybe it's about the play for money. I mean, who knows what's really in Euthyphro's mind. But what he's doing is, though, he's going to justify himself using holiness. In other words, it's just sort of like this. You can use your religion, you can use your belief in gods, because he's going to use gods in a minute, in order to justify terribly unjust acts, right? We don't like the infidels, so we're going to fly 747s into civilian office towers and kill innocent people, right? Why? Well, God said. Okay, this is the kind of thing that we're moving toward. But so all he's asking him is to define pious. Okay, that's it. Why? Well, obviously, if you're going to say, well, I'm, unjustly murdering this guy because I'm pious, obviously the question is, well, then, what is pious? So you need to define the term, right? Now think about how we define terms. We define terms by locating them in the larger concept in which they fit, right? So in other words, if I'm going to say, well, what is a tiger, right? So I need to define tiger. Well, the thing is, first of all, it's a cat. But it's a specific type of cat. I don't know, however you would, what a specified tiger. But the point is, it's like, here you have, of all things cat, you can divide, into sections here, because cat is the larger idea, and there's T for tiger, L for lion, whatever, J for jaguar, you get the point. There's all these different cats, right? But that's how you define a term. You have to put it in terms of its larger category, right? So we kind of keep this in mind as we move forward. He says, but notice what Euthyphro says. Euthyphro says in his first response, right? So Socrates said, tell me, what do you say holiness is? In other words, define the term. Euthyphro says, well, I say that holiness is doing what I am doing now, prosecuting the wrongdoer. Okay, let's go back to our board here. So the first definition, right, when he says, what is holiness? Euthyphro says, I guess we can call this 1. 2, for his first reaction is, do what I am doing. And then that is to prosecute wrongdoer. Okay. So we might be able to say, well, to prosecute the wrongdoer, okay, I mean, that would be like, a righteous thing, right? A holy thing, perhaps. But notice his first response, do what I am doing. That's significant. His first understanding of whether he's right or wrong, whether he's being godly or ungodly, whether he's being pious or impious, just or unjust, is, well, what I am doing. And so it's like, of course what I'm doing is right. Oh yeah, what I'm doing is prosecuting the wrongdoer. And so this, I don't want to pick on it too much, but this really opens up the theme of the entire dialogue. And notice how this concept of me is going to be a huge part of Euthyphro's entire attitude for the rest of the dialogue.